Hey everyone, so I'm re-releasing an episode that was recorded on November the 4th, 2019 with Dr. Andrew Arsan, who is a Lebanese British historian at the University of Cambridge. I'm re-releasing it as a sort of introduction to a series of episodes that will be exploring the post-October 17th landscape. In these episodes, we will be exploring the intersection between sectarianism, class, gender, and race, as well as topics such as the politics of quote-unquote whiteness in Lebanon and its relationship to the diaspora, the post-war neoliberal model, so what we might call the post-1990 consensus in Lebanon, what I am referring to as the Hezbollah question, so Hezbollah's role in Lebanon, especially since its intervention in Syria, and questions related to the environmental threats surrounding the country as well. The idea really is to approach October 17th as a framework through which we will try and understand the post-war era in Lebanon, as well as ask questions related to October 17th itself. So, have the protests succeeded? What does it mean to say that these protests have succeeded? And if they have failed, what does it mean to say that they have failed? And how have they failed? What are some of the threats that protesters in Lebanon might be expected to face in the near to long-term future? What are some threats that refugees in Lebanon might be facing, as well as migrant domestic workers who are already seeing today how the impacts of the combination of the financial crisis in Lebanon as well as the coronavirus crisis in Lebanon are affecting different people differently. And this is important to get into. It's very difficult. I'm not claiming expertise here. I'm just a researcher with a number of years of experience behind me so far, and I feel like at least I would be able to interview a number of very interesting people that would hopefully shine a light on some of these very difficult topics. So that's it for me. I hope you enjoyed this episode. As usual, if you'd like to support this podcast, you can do so on Patreon or on buymeacoffee.com, the links to which are in the description. And you will find all of the information on this episode as well as on the podcast, of course, on the website. Thank you very much. So, we're recording this on November the 4th, and it's quite interesting to be talking because we plan to have this conversation before the recent uprising / protest / revolution / however you want to call it that started on October 17th. And by a total coincidence, and obviously I will link the essay in the show notes, I wrote a review of your book, sort of like a personal reflection of what it meant for me to read it, and I published it just a week before everything happened. So the way I was thinking of how we can start this conversation is, first, if you don't mind, obviously just introducing yourself, and then telling us a bit, just kind of to kick off the conversation, like what was your motivation behind writing this book, and tied into that question, like why did you choose the year 2005 to 2018 and when it was published?
Sure. So my name is Andrew, depending on who you're speaking to, Arsan or Arsan. I'm a historian by training. I teach history at Cambridge, mostly Middle Eastern history as well as global history of 19th and 20th centuries. And Lebanon, Country in Fragments, my second book, my first book was on the Lebanese diaspora in French West Africa. The second book, this book that we're talking about, and everything else that we're talking about is a bit of a departure for me because I was trained to work on the early 20th century, on archives, the conventional stuff of the historical discipline. And for me, there was a personal need, a personal desire to write something about everything that I'd been living through as a Lebanese person living abroad, living in the diaspora, traveling to Lebanon regularly to see family, to see friends, to do research, to try and make sense of everything that I'd seen and witnessed and lived through in the years after 2005. Why 2005 to 2018? The reasons are quite simple, really. It's quite prosaic. left Lebanon in 1990 with my family. We lived in an area that had been very badly affected by the inter-Christian fighting late on in the Civil War, in the very last stages of the Civil War in 1989, 1990. My parents had lived through the Civil War that started in 1975. And then at that point, I think we're just at a breaking point, completely exhausted physically and psychically by everything they'd lived through, and decided to leave for France like a lot of other families at the time or earlier in the war. And so I actually didn't go back to Lebanon by complete coincidence for personal reasons between 1990 and 2005. And it was only in 2005, after the uprising of that year, the Intifada of 2005, that my brother finally said, look, I mean, enough is enough. I'm just going to buy you a plane ticket and you're going to come with me, and we're going to spend 3 weeks just seeing family and going around. And that was the start of everything. It rekindled my relationship with Lebanon. And I've been back every year for a spell, apart from 2006, when the July war meant I had to cancel my trip and I couldn't make it. But basically, the reasons for writing this book and for starting in 2005 are as much personal as they are intellectual or disciplinary. It just made deep, visceral, personal, emotional sense for me to write this book. And it helped my publisher was interested in it and saw a market for it and was willing to commission it, which meant a lot and meant that I could work on this. Yeah.
Well, that's quite perfect. I mean, the sort of unofficial theme of the podcast and the blog and everything is like the personal is political.
Mm-hmm.
That was actually the first episode that I did with my co-host Sarah, who's a Syrian writer and refugee in the States. But anyway, it's very interesting that it started in 2005. 2005 was also the first time I participated in any protest. I was 14 at the time. I wouldn't say I was necessarily politically savvy, but it was something that quite a significant part of the population, as you know, took part in, and we were part of it in our school in our region. And so to fast forward, as you said, so that between 2005 2018, a lot has happened in those 13 years that is really dizzying, to be honest. Kind of even think about it. Like one of the many things that we have been reflecting on in the past 3 weeks or so, since October 17th, because we're calling this like the October 17th revolution, is how much we kind of took for, I don't know if it's took for granted or maybe it was normalized, like the violence was just so diffused, it wasn't 24/7 bombings like you might have by the Assad regime in Syria or anything like that. It was just from time to time you would have a escalation of violence, whether it's the car bombs, the events, as the second chapter, your second chapter calls it, as that's how people call them, Hawadith, and that's I think how we even refer to the Civil War sometimes, all of it, like just the events.
Mm-hmm.
It's incredible how much of it was both overwhelming, while at the same time there was never really any answer to these crimes, to these bouts of violences and everything. So I guess my question is, you divide your book into the time of politics and the time of the everyday.
Mm.
It sort of feels connected to ask you, how did this come about? Because obviously many people, most books that I've read on Lebanon tend to focus on politics, tend to focus on, the sectarianism, on the sectarianism with the capital S, I guess you might call it, like how the system works, who are the main leaders, the history of it. There's never really been, there are some works, of course, but it's kind of relative new, I think, to really talk about, as you call it, the time of the everyday.
Yeah, the reason my intellectual rationale for splitting the book into two parts, roughly even parts, in length, was really to try and make sense of everything that you talked about, the dizzying political upheavals of the last 13, 14 years, and to try and give a political narrative, some kind of political structural context for people who knew Lebanon, but also people who maybe didn't know the country so well and wanted to familiarize themselves with its recent political history, with everything that's happened in the years since 2005. I think maybe I might have gone on a bit too much and put in a bit too much detail for some people. It ended up mushrooming the narrative in the first 3 chapters of the book, just as I tried to make sense of everything that has happened, all the upheavals. But really, I wanted to try and make sense of the ways in which political and structural forces do shape everyday life, and the way that feeling as though you live in a time of permanent crisis, a time of permanent precarity, shapes one's life, shapes one's subjectivity, shapes one's sense of oneself and relationship to immediate family, to friends, to work, to the world around you, basically, and all the choices that we make, staying in Lebanon, looking for work in Lebanon, emigrating, whatever it might be, the way in which the situation, to use that phrase that people use all the time, determines to an extent people's choices, and the ways in which they're able to operate, the strategies they devise to try and get through everyday life. So you were talking about violence, and I was interested in the way that we normalize acts of overt violence, street violence, car bombs, assassinations, and treat them almost as run-of-the-mill, as part of the everyday, because of, I guess, the psychic wounds that have accumulated over decades of political violence. But also try and make sense of the smaller scale, more insidious micro-violences of structural forces, the way that the particular economic system that the Lebanese live within and are now trying to overthrow, the particular political system that the Lebanese live within and are now trying to overthrow, shape the conditions of possibility, and what kinds of alternative futures the Lebanese might be able to imagine within those structural forces, and I guess the escape routes from those structures that they can try to envision and imagine and plot out. And I think that's what we're seeing now, is a very concerted effort increasingly to try and plot out some escape routes from the structures that have entrapped the Lebanese, at least since the end of the Civil War, if not kind of going back further, the Civil War itself, and then the post-independence decades, the post-colonial decades. So that was my choice, really, to try and make sense of the obvious kinds of violence that occupy the lives of the Lebanese, but also the more insidious, less obvious types of violence that shape who we are and how we live, and what we can try to do to escape them.
Yeah, and obviously a big a way to connect this is like your first chapter in the second part. So the 5th chapter. I have it open in front of me, like On Space in Capital in Contemporary Lebanon, in which you basically, if I remember it correctly, you take a walk in downtown Beirut, and you get, obviously you get stopped along the ways. There are these, I don't know if we can call them checkpoints. They're not really checkpoints, but like there are so many areas of downtown Beirut that are, most of it even, you might say, are completely inaccessible to most people. And this is in stark contrast with, in the past 3 weeks, there's been a concerted effort, and we have been seeing this whenever there are protests of significant intensity. You have this attempt to reclaim downtown Beirut, because that's El Balad, that's the historical downtown, which now is just called either downtown Beirut or obviously Solidaire, the private company that owns quite a lot of it. And it's very interesting how whenever we speak about space in Lebanon, it's almost like we don't know how to it's almost like we're trying to catch something that's immaterial. Like we don't really know how to describe it, because it's everywhere and yet nowhere at the same time. It has this duality to it that's very interesting and very exhausting, if because I lived in Beirut for some time, and it's an extremely exhausting thing to be in. And so I guess my question, if I'm trying to actually formulate the question here, we always speak about, in your book there's quite a heavy emphasis on time. Obviously the title of the 2 chapters, Time of Politics and Time of the Everyday, the 2 parts, sorry. And you reference quite a few times that this whole permanent present, or being permanently stuck in the present. And it's incredible to me how often I have seen this term in its different varieties. So one that I really like to use is called the protracted now. So it's just, everything is in the now, and even if we talk about the future, we're actually just talking about the present. Even if we talk about the past, we're actually just talking about how it's affecting the present. And I'm assuming, like, while you were writing this, that so I read your book twice, and I tried to think of like what could have gone through your mind while you were writing this, because I was reading this as I was accustomizing myself to becoming part of the diaspora, de facto anyway. I left in 2015 to do my studies, and now I'm sort of in between, and it's just very interesting to me, I guess, that you always try, like you were talking about the macro picture, and then you always try and talk about these as like I call them the nodes of resistance. So how migrant workers might live their lives in Lebanon, how they are navigating reality, and how this always represents something wider, and yet this something wider, corruption, sectarianism, clientelism, patriarchy, whatever, all of these things together, how it's always so difficult to just even name it. Like the act of naming seems to be like a huge part of the challenge. And the past 3 weeks that I've seen, a lot of it is about naming. Like so many of the graffitis are, this is not Solidaire, this is El Balad. Like these are the spaces, this is our city, this is our country. And I guess the question is, how have you been reacting after writing this book, which ends in 2018 if I'm not mistaken? How have you been reacting to the ongoing protests in the past 3 weeks? Like, how do you wish like that your book was published 2 years, like in 2 years or something? Like, is it something that you feel changes things, or maybe challenges things, or not really? I guess would be my question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I'm trying to work on reworking the epilogue to the book, actually, to try and bring it up to date as much as I can. I mean, things are changing every day, but I've got to get the epilogue into the publishers this week, and hopefully they're going to put out a second edition of the book in February, which is pretty exciting. I guess I'm trying to make sense of everything from a distance, from the diaspora, everything that's happening and has been happening for the last 3 and a bit weeks now in Lebanon, all across Lebanon. And I guess, if the question is, how does what's happened in the last 3 weeks, the revolution that has that started on the 17th of October, how has that changed things? I think it has. I mean, I think you were talking about space, about reclaiming space, about renaming and the politics of naming and reclaiming particular names for particular places. I think that's been one of the most poignant and moving things for me, one of the most beautiful things about the protests, the demonstrations of the last 3 weeks, is the way that demonstrators across Lebanon, particularly in Beirut, but elsewhere in Tripoli and Saida and Sur and Zur and other places, have reclaimed public spaces for the public and tried to recreate another idea of community, which is less bidden, less beholden to ideas of community as sect and sect as community. The idea that your political community and your social community can only be restricted to your confessional peers, to people of your own sect, your own confession. And I think there is a continuity there with at least the very early stages of 2005, before it was kind of colonized and taken over by political parties and organizations. And also the protests that we saw in 2015 in protest at the trash crisis that started that summer. And then also the efforts of civil society to organize in the wake of the trash crisis and to present electoral lists for municipal and parliamentary elections. So there are some continuities, definitely, in the kinds of programs that people are bringing to the table, in personnel, in the vision of the future that people are bringing, in the particular understanding of technocracy and expertise that people are also talking about when they talk about wanting to have a government of experts, a government of neutral experts for Lebanon. But I think it does change things in other ways. I mean, if I have to be completely honest, I've been out of Lebanon for a couple of months. I was last there in May and then again in June. And things felt pretty bleak back then. I mean, the economic situation, I don't need to tell you, felt really kind of, very, very bleak. And people, you felt a kind of hopelessness and a kind of sense of really being stuck in a rut and not knowing how to get out of it and what people could do to get out of it. And one thing that really struck me when I was there was a really prosaic, silly thing. We went to buy a present for a friend's daughter, a friend's little girl. And so we went to a mall, and all the staff in all of the shops were college students or kids who couldn't afford to go to college, 19, 20-year-olds. It felt like there was an entire generation that was basically just absent from the shops. The clientele, the shops were pretty much empty. The few customers who were either coming from abroad or, in their 40s and 50s and 60s and up. And the staff were basically teenagers. And it just felt like there was this generational absence in the middle. So I guess what has happened, in short, what's happened in the last few weeks has taken me by surprise, and I'm pleased and overwhelmed that it's happened. But I think, I was kind of following all the economic news, fear about the currency, discontent at taxes, and I guess I didn't see it coming, that the way that this has really kind of coalesced into something far bigger than what we saw in 2005 and what we saw in 2015, and potentially far more transformative in the vision that it has of the future.
Yeah, definitely. I think I mentioned I was one of the early organizers in 2015. Actually, I stopped being an organizer because I left to do my studies. And the big difference between 2015 and now is that the decentralization, obviously the fact that Beirut isn't really even the star of the story here, it's more or less, Tripoli, and to, Nabati, Yesu, Saida, parts of Alay, Zouk, and so on, even like down to Bint Jbeil and up to Akkar, we've seen protests as well. And as you said, like the fact that it's coalescing is there have been, television stations just interviewing people almost around the clock and on the streets. And you have basically themes that pop up as being so common. One is, of course, we are tired of being divided by sects. So that's the big anti-sectarian element to it. And the other one is, we are tired of having to migrate. And Lebanon has, as I think many people already know, has a massive diaspora. I think probably one of the biggest in the world per capita or something, I don't know. But it has always had this 1 foot, like when you grow up, when I went to school in Lebanon, I did my undergrad studies in Lebanon, you always had 1 foot ready to leave at any point. And there's always this thing, kind of a joke, but not really a joke at the same time, that you have to get two things: your degree and a foreign passport. That's what you have to get in order to make it. And I guess that in itself, while completely understandable, myself, I'm still part of it. Many of my friends are part of it. It also sort of creates a vicious cycle, in a sense, because we haven't really been. I'm not gonna say we haven't been trying to change things, because that wouldn't be true. It's more that we kind of lost hope. Like, we just got to the point where we do not know how things could change, because whenever we try to do anything, the forces against us, so to speak, were just so overwhelming on all sides. They came from the family, they came from the, our friends in the region, they came from obviously the political class, the media, and so on. And the reason why I was so struck by your book, and why it took me 2 reads before managing to actually write about it, is that it just really felt like it's like a biography that I would have written had I lived in an alternative universe, in a sense. Like, if I was if I probably was already in the diaspora, maybe, but also not. No, that's not accurate. Like, you're writing as someone who, sure, okay, you mentioned that you're part of the diaspora, but it's also very much in tune with with how things were happening on the ground, and which is, I think, very difficult to do. So congrats on that. And so the upcoming question, if you want, I'm always trying to formulate the question, because obviously I'm trying to just make this into a conversation. How have you managed again, I guess, again in the past 3 weeks, but maybe especially since 2015, because so your book ends on, Talat al-Hadkom, the Youth Link movement, on waste and the Lebanese body politic. That's the title of your last chapter, and then there's the epilogue. That episode, 2015, for me felt like this is the now or never moment. Like, it's either we make it work now or we're screwed. Like, that's really how it felt at the time. 2016, Beirut Medinati was also that again. And then the elections last year, that again. There's always this sense that we have to make it work now or else it's hopeless. And I'm wondering, like, have you felt this while researching the book, speaking to people and everything, this sense of hopelessness and how it creates a world on its own. It has its own language almost, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've definitely come up against that language of hopelessness, and I've felt both the hope that you were talking about, kind of, the sense that, yeah, this is the moment, this is the opening, this is the chink of light, this is when things have to happen. And then, I guess, the sadness, the disillusion when it doesn't happen, and then things return to normal and the political class reasserts itself in one way or another. The 2016 municipal elections were a case in point where, people closed ranks and very, very effectively played all the games that they know how to play against Beirut Medinati. But, I mean, I think, that language of hopelessness is something I've come up against in talking to people about the book, both when I was writing and then, having written it. I was talking to somebody who's working on a PhD with me here at Cambridge, who's Palestinian from Lebanon, and talking to her about the epilogue to the book and about what sort of note it might strike and kind of how optimistic or pessimistic it should be. She said, I don't think you're being pessimistic enough. And, another moment, I don't want to belabor the point, but kind of another moment, I was talking about the book at SOAS, and when I was writing it, and I guess I was talking about all the, canny strategies that Lebanese people have to navigate the system that they live in, the inventiveness, the creativeness that people demonstrate in their everyday life. And somebody asked me a question, do you think that they're creative, or do you just think that they're numb to the system that they live in and kind of, they're just anesthetized and just getting by because they have to get by? And it really struck me, the question, the comment, and stayed with me. But I think, what we're seeing now, right, is the fact that hopelessness has its own political energy and can generate a political language of change, of reform, of revolution. And I don't think we're just seeing it in Lebanon. We're seeing it in Iraq as well. We're seeing it in Algeria. We're seeing it in Latin America as well. There's a very, I don't want to sound too removed from the circumstances, but there's a very interesting moment here where, it's not right-wing populism that's kind of manifesting itself and kind of capturing and kind of capitalizing on people's discontent. It's something else. It's another kind of political energy, another kind of dissatisfaction with the prevailing economic and political structures. So, yeah, I guess what I'm saying is out of hopelessness, there can be hope.
If you like these episodes, I need your support. For as little as $1 a month, you can help me do this project for years to come. Please go to patreon.com/firethesetimes, that's patreon.com/firethesetimes, or buymeacoffee.com/joeyayub, that's buymeacoffee.com/joeyayub. If you're unable to donate, you can still support this project by sharing and leaving a review. If you have episode suggestions and topics you'd like me to discuss, you can head over to Twitter @firethesetimes or Instagram @theFireThesetimes and drop me a message. You can also contact me via email on the website's contact page. I really wouldn't be able to do this without you. Thank you for your time. I think that it was in Chile where I saw this sign, like, we are neither from the left nor the right, we are from below and we're coming for those at the top, which I find quite powerful. And in Lebanon, the the question that you said you would get a lot, like how do people navigate hopelessness, and I think it's a very good answer that hopelessness can have its own hope in a sense. The big question around that has always been, in my mind, probably like to a stereotypical extent, in terms of the media coverage it gets about Beirut being the party capital or whatever, and this has always had a very, very interesting. Even I think, if I'm not mistaken, in one of the reviews of your book, I forget which website, there was that famous image from 2006 of the women in the car passing through Dahi or something, and the image supposedly was supposed to denote how disconnected some Lebanese can be from the rest of Lebanon. And I always found this narrative very interesting because it never really felt true. While at the same time, it's not completely a lie. I'm not saying that there isn't a disconnect, but the way people have been dealing with trauma, essentially, because that's what it is for me, whether the Civil War era trauma or the multiple traumas of the so-called post-war, or in some ways the trauma of not talking about the war, the amnesia thesis, as I like to call it. There's something about how we deal with reality in Lebanon, or maybe if we're being optimistic about it, how we have been dealing with reality up until October 17th. Not that everything is going to change, obviously, in 3 weeks, but it's definitely the beginning of something new, I think, or I hope anyway. There's definitely something about how we had been dealing with reality, because in some ways it's like we're not denying it, but at the same time it's like we have lost any real capacity of dealing with it properly, if that makes sense.
I mean, when you were talking, I was thinking about, I don't know if you've seen this documentary, I forget the name of the artist who did it, but it's about rave culture in 80s Britain. It's called Everybody in the Place.
Okay.
And, it makes the argument that other people have made that rave culture, that acid house, emerged in 1980s Britain, really in response to the kind of sense of alienation that that young people had in particular from the society around them. It arose in response to Thatcherism, to neoliberal kind of monetarist policies of the time, unemployment, deindustrialization, urban blight, and people kind of escaped into another kind of protracted now, another kind of permanent present, which was nighttime and kind of these communities that can be created around music and around kind of euphoric release around music. So I guess, you could make the argument that you also see the same thing in Lebanon, that, in overt ways, maybe some forms of leisure in Lebanon are kind of resistance against the political system, but again, that in more subtle ways, in less explicit ways, they're just a way of evading, escaping structural forces. They don't offer a solution necessarily, but they offer a temporary kind of escape. I don't know. I guess that's one way of looking at it. I mean, the other thing is that, for you were talking about that 2006 photo and the way in which it's interpreted. I guess something that a lot of the foreign coverage of, Beirut nightlife or Lebanon as, a party capital overlooks is the way in which, at one level, a particular kind of nightlife and clubbing is kind of inequality on display. It's a way of displaying and affirming socioeconomic equality and inequality and the accumulation of capital by some people at very much to the expense and to the exclusion of others. So there's lots of different levels to it and lots of different ways in which I think to interpret kind of night culture, kind of nocturnal culture, leisure culture, away from all the conventional glosses of guys in tight t-shirts and women in tight dresses and everybody kind of partying under the stars or whatever the cliches are, and superstar DJs like coming to play in Roman ruins or whatever it is.
Yeah, we once had a joke that Tiesto, the DJ, came so often to Lebanon that he should just be given the nationality at this point. And, you hinted at this now, but there is this big argument that you make in the book, um, and I have the quote here, that basically that Lebanon is a microcosm of the contemporary world, a petri dish in which we can observe the microbial strains of late modernity. And then there's a whole paragraph that I would link to in the show notes as well. And that's obviously what inspired the title of my review, like our painfully ordinary country. That there is something about Lebanon where we keep on telling ourselves, and we keep especially keep on telling other people. We love to say this to other people, that Lebanon has this extraordinary thing about it, and yet, and I don't mean to be downer. I'm not saying that there's nothing amazing about Lebanon. That's not really the point here. It's more that whenever we would, at least in my experience, try to sell Lebanon in a sense to foreigners, especially Westerners, let's be honest, we would glorify it without actually knowing what to say. Like we would talk about it while at the same time not being entirely sure how to defend the craziness inherent in some of the things that we've been talking about, and in many of the things that that parts of the UK and the US, for example, woke up to in the wake of Trump and Brexit, haven't really been new in Lebanon. Fake news and disinformation, how facts can be so malleable and all of that. As you make a good case for it as well in your book, that Lebanon sort of has been doing this for the whole post-war era. Obviously during the Civil War they've been doing it anyway, but in the post-war era that continued. And the privatization of space, and I guess we might say the privatization of time, is what the past 3 weeks for me especially have been about. For me personally, I'm not going to say everyone is thinking about this in the same way. There are people with more urgent needs, if you want, people who are working class and so on. But it does strike me as very interesting, maybe even disturbing. I don't know. I'm not sure how you feel about it. How whenever we talk about Lebanon, there are always these the underground world of Lebanon that is really not really mentioned, and that's why I really appreciated your chapter. I think the 6th chapter was Al-Akharin, or the others, or Lebanon's refugees and migrant workers. And I guess what I wanted to get my point, I would struggle to actually make a point in the end. Have you been able to look at Lebanon differently after speaking to people who are usually ignored by, let's call it, discourse on Lebanon by the Lebanese in general?
Hello, my name is Ban Chimer. I am the founder of Inyalinya Basiddet organization. Inyalinya Basiddet, it's feminist and a feminist organization focusing on domestic worker in Lebanon. Because of the coronavirus and the lockdown, many domestic workers are suffering behind closed door, and they can't even feed their kids. Because of that, we are gathering food and distributing home to home. But we want to do more, and we set up also GoFundMe accounts. If anyone is interested to donate, we'll be grateful. And you can find this link in our Twitter at Inalinya DWU. Thank you so much.
There's a lot there.
Yeah, I know. Sorry.
No, I'm just trying to, think through all of it. I mean, to go to your last point first, yeah, I mean, I think, talking to domestic workers or refugees, displaced workers, because the Syrians that I spoke to were both refugees and people who'd been engaged in cyclical labour migration for years before 2011 and before the Syrian revolution started and before the violence started that consumed Syria and destroyed Syrian society. But yeah, I mean, it always gives you a different perspective. But also here, I mean, I think it's the point where I want to acknowledge the work of other people, because that chapter was the hardest for me to write because, if I'm being honest, I didn't do kind of the ethnographic field work that really would be required for that chapter in Palestinian communities or amongst Syrians or amongst domestic workers. And there I really lent on the work of others who are really kind of opening up paths and trying to think about labour migration to Lebanon and refuge and displacement in Lebanon, and the very precarious, very dark conditions that people live in, and the spaces of opportunity that they're able to open up even within those very precarious conditions. So, earlier we were talking about public space and about leisure, and really in the book I was trying to pick up on a lot of the new exciting literature and scholarship on Lebanon by anthropologists, by geographers, by urban planners, by sociologists, that has become much more attentive to these questions and much less interested in examining, as you were talking about earlier, the confessional power sharing system, in a quite rigid political science sort of way, where Lebanon is either kind of regarded as extraordinary or is one of a few cases of particular kind of sectarian power sharing alongside, I don't know, Northern Ireland, for example. I don't know where I'm going with this. I guess, I mean, to go back to that last point, absolutely, it does change your perspective. But I think, I mean, you've alluded to this before. I mean, I guess I've always had a slightly askew perspective on Lebanon, partly because I grew up abroad, and so my memories of Lebanon are of the civil war, of being a young kid, really young kid in the war, but also because part of my family, my dad's family, is partly originally from Aleppo, and so kind of my grandfather was from Halab, from Aleppo, and so I grew up in a family that was both deeply Lebanese but also kind of in some ways not entirely Lebanese, and I've kind of at times felt that kind of deep, I don't know what you want to call it, xenophobia, ambiguity, ambivalence that some Lebanese have towards Syrians, even kind of, middle-class, francophone, Christian people of Syrian descent who have Lebanese passports and think of themselves as Lebanese. So I guess I've always looked at it from a slightly different angle. I mean, I don't want to overdo it because I'm also kind of picking up on a lot of scholarship, a lot of work that other people have done, but there are different ways in which you can look at the country from a slightly odd, different angle, and have both that kind of deep emotional proximity and also a certain distance that I guess comes with living in diaspora, and feeling the place is yours but also not yours. It's home but also definitely in lots of ways not home.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense as well. And I guess we can wrap it up in a sense on the last chapter, because obviously that's the most recent one, 2015 and the 2016 elections. We're seeing today, so to give some background to those who don't know, I'll briefly mention that in 2016 there was the municipal elections in Beirut, and you had this independent list called Beirut Madinati, Beirut My City, and they were up against, and they were basically engineers, architects, one movie director, one singer, independent people, more or less well known to different extents, and they were up against pretty much the whole government, like pretty much every single one of them. Hezbollah wasn't part of it, but was supporting it. Everyone else, from Hariri to I think Jumblat and Louet, Lebanese forces, the Free Patriotic Movement, Amal, they were all part of this Bierte, Beirutis. And yet, even with the whole weight of the state, they were still barely able to get a majority. And a huge part of it has been that, people just don't vote. It's not something that I think something like 20%, 30% of the population voted. I'm not sure actually.
Yeah, I think turnout was pretty low. I can't remember what it was, but it was pretty low, particularly in municipal elections.
It was something like 20,
Beirut, yeah.
30 or something. I'm not sure, but... And I think even in 2018 also it was fairly low as well during the elections. I guess what I'm trying to get at is the events that have been happening since 2015 feel like it has put Lebanon, or at least part of its politics, in a different trajectory that it might have gone had 2015 not happened, had the waste crisis and then the subsequent movement, and then, Beirut Medinati in 2016 and so on. Had they not happened, I struggle to see how the ongoing uprising could have happened. But even, let's say it could have happened, I struggle to see how this hopelessness that turns into hope, how it could have happened without the mistakes of the past. Because 2015 was good, but at the same time there were so many mistakes that were done within the movement. Too middle class, too Beirut centric, etc., etc. And it feels like the mistakes that had happened back then, I'm not going to say we're completely immune to it now, but there is definitely a difference between how, for example, as they are called, the men on the scooters, usually working class men from the suburbs of Beirut. In 2015, they were treated with suspicion. In 2019, people were applauding them, and this blew my mind. There were people, from all walks of life, working class and middle class, whatever. When these guys were coming in, they were just being applauded, and there is this recognition that even if you are part of a sectarian political party, which, let's face it, many people are, if not officially, but your family is or whatever, there has to be a space for you. There has to be something that has to be built with you, but it has to be against those sectarian warlords. And I feel that we're getting there. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to sound too optimistic. That's such unlike me. But there are definitely things that are happening on the ground that objectively have not happened before. And it would simply be an act of sheer cynicism to deny that these things are positive developments. And so I guess for the first time, maybe for the first time for someone who studies Lebanon, is, well, how are you going to think now about good things that might happen, not just bad things that are happening all the time?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I think one way to respond is to say that, this moment, I was talking earlier about how unprecedented it is in lots of ways. And you were talking about, some of the mistakes that came about in 2015. But I think one of the things that has carried through from 2015 is the kind of sense of the carnivalesque, the celebratory, the kind of subversive current and kind of joyous current that runs through the demonstrations. And that in itself gives you hope that people can muster up so much energy and so much kind of creativity in the face of political circumstances. But the other thing I wanted to say is, there are lots of ways in which looking at the history of Lebanon over the longue durée, over the long run, can make you depressed. If you look at the way in which Lebanon or the spaces, the regions that become Lebanon, in some ways are a case study for the long-term effects of market relations and market structures on society, and the way that they kind of, pull at social relations and kind of distort them. Right, Lebanon's a great starting point for thinking about that. If you go back even to the 16th or 17th century, as I'm trying to do now, writing a history of the lands that become Lebanon, it becomes apparent just how deeply rooted some of the market structures that really come together in the 20th century are. But the other thing is there are moments of contestation that we can look to and precedents that we can look to. I don't know if you know the work of Ziad Aboudish, who works on Jadaliya, is one of the co-editors, part of that collective at Jadaliya. But his PhD in his upcoming first book looks at the social mobilization in the first years of independence between 43 and 55 roughly. And the way that movements came together in those years, to push for liberalisation of trade union laws and labour laws, to push for female suffrage, for women getting the vote, to push for nationalisation of electricity provision and infrastructure. And, historians and sociologists have a tendency to look at these movements as less than successful in some ways, but Ziad Bourish kind of shows the ways in which they were successful in some ways, in creating a space in which trade unions could mobilise, even if maybe not as effectively as some would have wanted them to, where women could get the vote, even if gender inequality still remains a systemic feature of Lebanese life, and where utility provision could be nationalised, even if it was patchy, even in the years before independence. So I guess I'm saying, the picture isn't entirely black and white, but certainly, you can look to precedents of successful mobilisation and of moments where ordinary Lebanese people, men and women, have been able to come together to effect change. It wasn't perfect, but they were able to do something, and they were able to kind of create something in the face of opposition from the political class. Thinking aloud and looking at what's happening at the minute, one thing that is striking, and it might change, but is the way that the political class is divided in its response in a way that it wasn't in 2015 or 2016. You were talking about the way that in the municipal elections in 2016, most of the political parties came together in a single list to, push away the threat of civil society in the Beirut Medinati. We're still in very early stages now, but it is striking that, the political class isn't quite as united and is openly squabbling about the way in which it should respond to everything that's been happening in the last 3 weeks. And that in itself kind of maybe gives you some hope that they won't be able to deploy the same sorts of resources that they have done in the past to push back against popular mobilisation and to stifle popular mobilisation. And the other thing is kind of just the level of anger, the way that it is decentralised and not Beirut-centric, and the way that it, has affected most, if not all, regions of Lebanon. And again, kind of, to close, it's again, I think, kind of a sense of hopelessness, creating a sense of energy and a sense of a desire for change, because, there are structural forces at play here that aren't just Lebanese. I think the Syrian civil war has affected people across Lebanon in lots of different ways. If you look at Tripoli, it's affected people in one way. If you look at the south or the southern suburbs of Beirut, Dahye, again, it's affected people in another, where people, have, family members have gone off to fight in Syria, have returned traumatized, have not returned, where it's taken a toll on people's livelihoods, on people's everyday lives, on education, and has kind of come as an extra layer of pressure and stress and strain on top of all the kind of economic pressures that people are living with, the poverty that people are living with that you were talking about, and the inequality that people are living with, and the patchy, if not entirely non-existent utility provision that people are living with. I guess that has also kind of, been something that's been steadily building in the years since 2015, 2016. The effect, the deep kind of structural effects of the Syrian war on Lebanon, and the response of most politicians has simply been xenophobia and nativism, right, as you know, and just kind of, like Jabran Basil, kind of, let's send all these people back, let's ship them back to Syria, and that's the way to relieve pressure on Lebanese society. But clearly that's not enough, and I think people across all communities and sects and regions know that it's not enough, and that populist rhetoric and nativist, racist rhetoric isn't enough to solve the very deep-rooted structural issues that Lebanon is facing, and that we need more systemic change. And I think that's what has been manifesting in the last 3 weeks.
Yeah, I quite agree, and I think that's quite an awesome way of of wrapping it up, basically. Andrew, thank you so much for your time on this.
Thank you, Joey. It's been great talking to you. I really, really enjoyed it.